would-be politician to support a family. The couple agreed that Woodrow should become a professor instead. Wilson enrolled in graduate school at Johns Hopkins University. When his doctoral thesis was published, it received glowing reviews in newspapers across the country. America's federal government was dangerously weak, Wilson argued, and needed to be strengthened.
He got fascinated with...
Today we are going to discuss the life of the President Woodrow Wilson. Who is the Woodrow Wilson? Woodrow Wilson was the President of the United States, and he ruled for the 2-term consecutive. He was the 28th President of the United States. He ruled for the 2 terms consecutive, and during his time, tenure, he faced a lot of challenges, especially there was arrival from the economic powers, the war in Europe, as you are aware. There was a uprising, this outrage of the World War I after assassination of the Duke. So he was the one who sealed by the nation his decision. So there is a time whereby you have to make a tough decision to calculate whatever it is. So 1914, there was assassination of Archduke Duke. That was because of the rise of the World War I between France and Germany and the Allies. So Woodrow Wilson, before his presidency, let us see his life before his presidency, and also he was a professor. Woodrow Wilson, by the way, was a professor.
How do politics really work? That was his one subject entirely throughout his life, was how does power really work? And in turn, how can I wield it? Wilson wanted to wield power.
When he was just 33, Wilson was offered a full professorship at his alma mater, Princeton. He became an enormously popular teacher.
In fact, he became a professor at the age of the youngest age, 33 years old.
In 7 out of 8 years, he was voted favorite professor. We came into contact with a mind rich with knowledge, one student said. No one could touch him as a lecturer. At the end of his classes, Wilson was often given a standing ovation. Professor Wilson's lectures addressed the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in America in the early 1890s. Captains of industry like the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans had become fabulously wealthy, while the majority of American workers lived in poverty. Wilson was deeply influenced by a book of photographs by Jacob Riis, titled How the Other Half Lives. Riis's photographs had created a national sensation by exposing the squalor in which many Americans lived.
There had been economic and social and
It was somebody whose fight is to see the gap between middlemen, the poor one, or those from humble background, and the richest. That gap has been also come into low point, someone who ensure there is no a widened gap. So he made sure at this administration to see this fairness of the trades, among of trade in terms of the implementing of the policy, and also to see there is a peace between the East country and also the other countries like Mexico. But what's the thing about the Woodrow Wilson was this issue? He was somebody who is a poor person in foreign policy. The way he handled the issues of after assassination of the president of Mexico when he was a president, he handled very poorly. and that is why the disadvantage of the Woodrow Wilson was he was a person who is poor in foreign policy.
Political inequity in this country, certainly since the Civil War. The Depression of 1894, however, brought to the fore in glaring terms the level of inequity that existed. When you have a depression in which 20% of the American people are unemployed, thousands of businesses are going under, thousands of banks are going under, you have to begin to question whether this corporate elite is really running the show in the most equitable and wise fashion.
Across the nation, rapidly growing populist and socialist movements were demanding real change. But the corporate elite refused to budge. Open warfare between strikers and union busters threatened to shut down factories and coal mines. Many feared that the nation was about to descend into chaos. Professor Wilson was one of the few who had a practical solution. Give America's government new power to rein in big business.
He came to the conclusion that the government of the United States really did have to respond to these problems, that there was a kind of social compact between the people and the government, and working people were the people. He was a bit fearful also that if neither of the major parties responded more forthrightly, then you were asking for bigger trouble down the road. If you didn't let some steam out of the pot, it was going to blow up in your face.
Wilson's articles in magazines like Harper's attracted nationwide attention, and offers to speak to political clubs and civic organizations began to pour in.
Modern industry has so distorted competition as to put it into the power of some to tyrannize over many, and enable the rich and strong to combine against the poor and weak.
He apparently had an extraordinary effect on audiences, and his voice was powerful and very moving. And I think when he spoke, he put his whole heart and soul into it and enjoyed it very much.
In fact, we have two presidents who can write, people who serve their own. For example, Woodrow Wilson was somebody who can write his own speech, and Barack Obama. So funny thing about the Woodrow Wilson, he fight for his time to see his words they match with the actions. Especially, I remember the time when he was addressing the Congress in person, not in papers. So he talked in person what is on in mind.
I think he was probably at his best when he spoke.
Soon, a buzz began to spread about the eloquent Mr. Wilson. Before long, he was the most famous man at Princeton.
And also he was a member of the Democrat. He succeeded from the William, which was a Republican, William M. Taft, 27th president, and 26 was Theodore Roosevelt. I know most of them, they know the Theodore Roosevelt, or many books they wrote there. So I remember there were debates among those three people. So he was very contentious of that time.
Few were surprised when at 46 he was named president of the college. But Joseph Wilson believed that God had even greater plans for his son. This is only the beginning of a very great career, he told all who would listen. During his early years as president of Princeton, Wilson continued to receive invitations from around the nation to speak about political reform. He was time and again overwhelmed with applause, the Baltimore Sun wrote, and had to wait until the clapping ceased to be heard again. Harper's declared that Wilson was a man the nation would do well to pay attention to. By any measure, the Princeton president's star was on the rise. Then, on the morning of May 28, 1906, the Wilson household was thrown into panic. Woodrow awoke to discover that he had lost sight in one eye. Ellen rushed him to the hospital, where doctors discovered that the blood vessels behind Wilson's left eye had hemorrhaged. Back home, Nellie and her sisters waited anxiously for news of their father's condition.
We were at the door waiting when they returned. Father was calm, but after one look at Mother's face, we knew that something dreadful had happened.
Endorse the splendid program of the progressives to put things forward by fairness, by justice. I endorse the splendid program of the progressives to put things forward by fairness, by justice, by a concern for all interests.
The election went just as Sugar Jim Smith had planned. Wilson led the Democrats to a statewide sweep.
After he won a Democratic primary, so he gave him away for the main election to their competitors, Tito Roosevelt of Boone's party and the William of the Republican. And the funny thing of them, all of them, they was former students of the Harvard University. Professor Woodrow Wilson, Tito Roosevelt, and William M. Taft.
Immediately after the new governor was sworn in, Sugar Jim came calling at the Capitol to give Wilson his marching orders.
Bankers and the corporate titans and so on, in language that was precise.
To use a phrase of Theodore Roosevelt, the American voters, especially middle-class voters, were in 1912 in an heroic mood. They were in heroic mood demanding change.
It's one of the most significant elections in all of American history because it involves a philosophical debate about the nature of government, of a depth and a sophistication that we've rarely seen in American politics.
On the right was the Republican candidate, President William Howard Taft, running for a second term with strong support from big business. On the left was socialist Eugene Debs, who told his millions of supporters that it was time for the working class to run America. Two candidates were trying to win the voters in the middle. One was Wilson. The other was former President Theodore Roosevelt, running as leader of his new Bull Moose Party. Both Roosevelt and Wilson were reformers. It was the only thing they had in common. Where Roosevelt was blustering and charismatic, Wilson often seemed cold and distant. Where Roosevelt was a baby kisser and backslapper, a reporter had once said that shaking Wilson's hand was like shaking a dead fish. Wilson was painfully aware of their differences.
He appeals to their imagination. I do not. He is a real, vivid person who they have seen and shouted themselves hoarse for and voted for millions strong. I am a vague, conjectural personality, more made up of opinions and academic prepossessions than of human traits and red corpuscles.
I think they were two very different personalities. Roosevelt had a reputation of being one of the most kinetic, if not frantic, political personalities of his era. Wilson was much more cerebral, much more careful and precise. But beneath that scholarly demeanor of his, there was quite a passionate individual, passionate about politics, often passionate about his own personal life.
As Election Day neared, the Roosevelt camp came into possession of one of Mary Peck's steamy love letters to Wilson, which was apparently stolen from Wilson's luggage. Roosevelt's advisors urged him to release the letter to the press. But Roosevelt refused. It was hopeless, he said, to convince the public that a man who looked like a drugstore clerk was, in reality, a Romeo.
They didn't release the letters, and I think that's why most people have trouble seeing Woodrow Wilson as this passionate man, because he did look like the druggist on the corner, you know. He was very academic, those steel-rimmed glasses, he always seemed very serious, but he was an extremely passionate person.
Wilson's best hope against Roosevelt was to speak to Americans in person. He crisscrossed the nation, warning his audiences that big business was cutting average Americans out of their fair share of the
As you are aware, the most supporters of the Democratic is from the Middle West, and Republican from even the inception of that party was supported by the business people up to now.
nation's wealth.
We must choose whether we shall continue to have our affairs dominated and determined by small groups of men, or whether we shall again assert the individual independence of the American people in the conduct of their business and their politics.
Wilson promised Americans a new freedom, a new opportunity for the average person to get ahead in the world.
The difference between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson at that time was that Woodrow Wilson wanted to enact a very tough antitrust law to break up the big corporations into smaller units. Then the government could sit back and have a kind of self-regulating economy so that smaller business people, the man on the make, he used that phrase a lot, could have an opportunity to realize their full potential. This is part of what he meant by the new freedom.
Wilson spent Election Day at the governor's home in New Jersey. After dinner, he read Ellen and his daughters a poem by Browning about the importance of accepting God's will.
Indeed, the special marking of the...
I remember the time when he was after won the election. I remember some supporters, he came to demand some promises to be fulfilled. But Wilson, he told them, you know what? I was being elected by God. I was being elected by God. Let me serve the rest of the people in fairness.
Prone submission to the heavenly will, seeing it, what it is, and why it is.
Nellie was the first to hear the sound that signaled the outcome of the election.
I heard the first muffled tone of the bell of old Nassau Hall. Another moment, it was ringing like a thing possessed. I ran to one of the front windows. In all directions, there were people coming. Swarms had already invaded the little garden and were crowding around the porch. Swaying torches made grotesque circles of light. And there, a red glare shining full on his face, was Father. Utterly unfamiliar. He was no longer my father. These people, strangers who had chosen him to be their leader, now claimed him. He belonged to them.
On March 3rd, 1913, the Wilsons arrived in Washington to celebrate Woodrow's inauguration as president. But the family had as much to worry about as celebrate. Wilson had won just 43% of the vote, hardly a mandate. Before the election, he had forecast that the life of the next president would be hell, and said that the stress of the job might well kill him.
So it was somebody who was stressing about the income of the heavy duties waiting for him in the White House after he won the election, or after he outsmarted his competitors. So he was having heavy duties to know how to balance the works of the middlemen according to his promise they were going to protect the rights of the middlemen. So his heavy duties was waiting for him.
Ellen was also worried about what the strain of the presidency would do to Woodrow's blood pressure. But as Nellie helped her mother prepare for an inaugural tea at the White House, the first sign came that it was Ellen who was in trouble.
I arranged her hair and adjusted her prettiest hat at just the right angle. She hardly said a word. Then, suddenly, putting both hands over her face, she burst into tears. There was almost despair in her sudden break. Something I had never seen before. I was afraid that Mother was ill. As she left with Father, I cried with black despair. It will kill them. It will kill them both.
Before the earlier years before 1937, acquisition was done after 3 months somebody being elected in November. So inauguration most of them was done at 4th of March. So after 1997, President Roosevelt changed or he shipped up to January 20th. That is the calendar whereby it still exists up to now.
On March 4th, 1913, Wilson was inaugurated the 28th President of the United States. Soon after he took office, Wilson announced that he would do something no president in 113 years had done: address the Congress in person. Then he sat down at his typewriter, a machine which he had been one of the first Americans.
So most of during the time when he was addressing Congress in person, he sat down with his typewriter. He speak on his mind, or he engaging with his mind directly, not any written material.
To embrace, and began tapping out his speech.
I am very glad indeed to have this opportunity to address the two houses directly, and to verify for myself the impression that the President of the United States is a person, not a mere department of the government hailing Congress from some isolated island of jealous power, sending messages, not speaking naturally and with his own voice. That he is a human being, trying to cooperate with other human beings in a common service.
As he settled into his new job, Wilson established a strict schedule. He arrived at 8 each day for a breakfast of coffee, oatmeal, and 2 raw eggs in fruit juice, like swallowing a newborn baby, he said. He then dictated.
So if somebody worked with his arts, I remember most of the time he spent mostly of the 3/4 of his time at office. So he was busy to see their nation the way you find. He could have wished to see it the way after he left is in a better position. That was a charisma person, and he had a good traits. He portrayed a good traits of the leadership.
Did from 9 to 10 a.m. and saw visitors until 1. After lunch with his family, he returned to his office. Nearly all who came to see him there were struck by the president's deep sense of mission. When the chairman of the Democratic Party came to demand a job in return for helping Wilson win the presidency, Wilson told him that it was not the Democratic Party, but God who had made him president.
A character in any president is an important part of the way he handles his office. Now, in Wilson's case, let's just take one aspect of his character, his certitude that he was right. Now, certitude is a great asset when you have to fight for what you believe in and when you convince other people that you're correct. But certitude is a serious obstacle when you're trying to achieve something to which there's a good deal of opposition and where it's necessary to compromise in order to have your way.
Wilson was fortunate that in his early days in office, there was little organized opposition to his plans for change. In a rapid-fire series of bills, he was able to toughen antitrust laws, win new protections for labor unions, create the Federal Reserve System to make loans more easily available to average Americans, and give government the resources it needed to rein in big business by creating the first lasting income tax.
The first 2 years of Wilson's first term are one of the most remarkable moments in modern American politics. There's more reform agenda accomplished in that brief moment than in virtually any other 2-year period in the 20th century. He lays down the rhetorical markers about how the state must step forward to insulate citizens against the volatilities of the free market. This has defined the character of American politics ever since.
In a second round of reforms, Wilson pushed through the first law mandating an 8-hour workday and the first law banning child labor.
There's a very nice coincidence for Wilson. In many ways, the kind of ideas that the progressives and programs that they had begun to agitate for are exactly the kind of things that he had been studying for over 20 years. How do you make government more accountable? How do you make it more open? How do you exercise power both more efficiently and more openly and more answerably there? And it's the man and the moment found each other beautifully in that.
It was an impressive record, but not an unblemished one. Many prominent African Americans had supported Wilson in 1912 because of his promise that his new freedoms would apply to all Americans equally. But once he was in office, Wilson sided with the many Southern Democrats in Congress and in his cabinet who favored segregation. During his first term, the House passed a law making racial intermarriage a felony in the District of Columbia.
The only achievement, or we still remembering when he signing the law of the racial money in the colony of Colombia. It was a great achievement for those special racists or special those people who was being affected by the racial race.
Then, Wilson's new Postmaster General overturned 50 years of integration by ordering that his Washington offices be segregated. Soon, plans were made to segregate many other federal departments.
To understand Woodrow Wilson's racial views, it is important to remember that he was a Southerner. He had been raised in a climate in which it was presumed that African American people were less evolved than Anglo-Saxon people. This was not a casual assumption on his part. It was one that was ingrained in his whole being.
In 1914, newspaper publisher William Monroe Trotter led a delegation of African Americans who had endorsed Wilson to the White House. Trotter angrily asked the president, "Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens?"
They demand an accounting from Woodrow Wilson. They supported the man, and these are the consequences. And Wilson pleads misunderstanding and suggests that what is being done is really a boon and a benefit to the African Americans. It's taking away the tension in the workplace, as it were. Well, Trotter will have none of this, and voices rise and tempers rise until Wilson excuses Trotter from his presence. As Trotter leaves, he does something quite extraordinary. He convenes his own press conference on the grounds of the White House and reenacts the exchange just transpired between him and the president.
Wilson was furious that a black man would dare to publicly question him. For the rest of his presidency, he would make no effort to improve race relations in America.
In every man's life, there's the possibility of making a considerable difference by attitude, by a word spoken, by something done or not done. You'd have to say that in the area of race relations, Woodrow Wilson was deficient on all those points. He neither said what should have been said, he neither did what should have been done, nor did he understand what needed doing.
It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. All of my preparation has been in domestic affairs.
In fact, he was very poor person in foreign policy, the way he handled the issues of the after president of Mexico was being assassinated.
In Wilson's first month in office, Mexico erupted in revolution when its democratically elected president was murdered by the Mexican military.